Here to dive into industry trends with leading ETF experts, this is ETF Spotlight with Neena Mishra.
Hello and welcome to ETF Spotlight. I'm your host, Neena Mishra. My guests today are Andrew Channon, CEO of Procure AM, and Micah Walter-Range, founder of Space Investment Services. And Micah is also the index developer for the UFO ETF. We're talking about space today. And this past Saturday, May 30th, was a historic day. Elon Musk's SpaceX became the first private company to launch humans into space. And more important, it was the first launch of NASA astronauts from the US soil in almost a decade. And watching the successful launch and docking of the capsule with the International Space Station the following day was so incredible and so inspiring and uplifting, and particularly because of so many other heartbreaking scenes that we have been watching every day now about the pandemic and civil unrest. Andrew and Micah, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having us back.
So to start off, tell us about the launch and a little bit about the Falcon 9 rocket, which I understand is reusable, and the Dragon capsule.
So with space, there's a tremendous amount of history, and you really have to go back and look at how these different things develop to understand just how important a single event can be. And you highlighted some of the main points about how this is the first orbital human launch from American soil in nearly a decade. And what had happened during the course of that time, of course, is the space shuttle had been retired in 2011 after many, many successful flights. And so the question was, how do we get back to having that national capability to send people into space? Because we had the International Space Station, much of which it was paid for by Americans and operated by NASA in cooperation with a number of international partners. But there was no way for NASA to launch astronauts other than to go through the Russian system. And so the Russians had been providing this transportation for us ever since the shuttle was retired. So there were two different development paths that were moving in parallel. NASA was developing its own human spaceflight system, the SLS rocket and the Orion capsule. But then they also did something that is very unusual. They created this parallel commercial transportation system. And they started off keeping it pretty simple, only carrying cargo. So they weren't ready to just say, okay, we're going to put out a contract and some company off the street can come in and say, sure, we'll fly astronauts to space for you. No, they said, you're going to start off by flying cargo because the space station needs a lot of supplies. You need to send up air, water, food, everything else that you need, certainly all the research experiments. So they started with that. And SpaceX was one of the providers for that service. And then back in, I think it was 2010, they started the Commercial Crew Program at NASA. So they started it a year before the shuttle retired. And they knew there was going to be a gap. There's no way you can create a completely new human space launch system in a year. The question was how long that gap would be. So the hope at the time was that we'd be doing these launches, by 2017. Well, sometimes there are delays with developing space systems, pretty much always. And so it has taken a little bit longer, but we've finally gotten there. And that Commercial Crew Program went through a number of different iterations. And so different companies have been involved at earlier stages, and they gradually down-selected to the point where now Boeing and SpaceX have this contract to provide the transportation services on a commercial basis. And while SpaceX did get there first, we're looking forward to having Boeing providing those services in the near future as well, because it's always good to have multiple providers and redundant systems just in case something happens to one of them. So, very exciting to have SpaceX doing this. As you mentioned, the Falcon 9 rocket is reusable. They started off, I believe, with a fresh one. Never been flown for this particular flight, but SpaceX has demonstrated a considerable degree of success reusing that launch vehicle for some of its satellite launches in previous cases. So we'll see. It may take a little longer before they're comfortable reusing one for human spaceflight, but there is that option down the road. And the Dragon capsule itself, again, all new design, but drawing very much on the heritage of the capsules that you would have seen, say, in the Apollo program. It was a design that worked extremely well. SpaceX has been using the cargo version of the Dragon capsule for a number of years now to provide those cargo services to the space station. And we're all very eager to see how the crew version of the capsule continues to perform.
Very exciting and very interesting. So what is the aim of this mission, and how long the two astronauts, Bob and Doug, will be at the International Space Station? When and how they will return to Earth?
So the aim of the mission is mostly to prove that it works. In NASA terminology and under the terms of the contract, this is the Demo 2 mission. So the Demo 1 mission was last year, and that was same model of capsule, the crew version, but without any humans on board. So they flew that, it docked with the space station autonomously, it came back, and so that was a successful test as far as they were concerned. Then they ran into some other problems with different systems between then and now, which is why it took so long to get to the Demo 2 mission. Those seem to have been sorted out. And so the purpose is to fly to the space station and then return people safely, which is always the goal. In terms of what the astronauts, Bob and Doug, will be doing there, as it turns out, instead of just a quick 2 or 3 week mission as originally planned, however long ago, it turns out that they could even be staying up to 4 months. And the reason for that is the space station typically has a crew of 6. Right now they have a crew of 3. Again, you have a lot of planning here between all of the different partners, trying to make sure that you're taking a certain number of people up at one time, and then maybe they're overlapping a little bit, different crews, and a different group of people come back. And you're just trying to manage how long any particular astronaut spends in space. And sometimes there are gaps when there aren't as many people up there. So because they're a little short-staffed, it's fantastic that these astronauts are able to be there and help out. And they have experience. They were shuttle astronauts before being a part of SpaceX's program. And so they're more than capable of doing spacewalks, other maintenance on the station. They'll be able to help out with some of the research. And this is something that people often ask, well, what is the point of the International Space Station? The primary reason it exists is as a research facility. It's not just there so we can say, well, we have people in space. The thing about that is you do still need a certain amount of time just to keep the space station running. And so if you have a limited number of crew and they're spending all their time maintaining the station, then there's not much research being done. So having the extra hands available will be extremely valuable. And so we'll see. It's still to be determined exactly when they'll come back. But I'm sure that will be a momentous occasion in its own right.
Exactly. And we wish them all the success of the mission and safe return to Earth. Now, what does this mission and the successful completion of this mission mean mean for NASA's partnership with private companies? And you mentioned that this commercial crew program started with cargo, and now they will be sending astronauts and probably private citizens too. And in addition to this program, NASA is also partnering with other companies like Blue Origin and Virgin Galactic. So in general, what does this mission mean for these partnerships and the future of commercial space program?
So one of the things that I think is important to remember is when it comes to commercial space activity, SpaceX is still very much operating as a government contractor at this point. A lot of people look at the fact that they've raised, at this point, more than $3 billion in private capital for the company. They've also received more than $7 billion in government grants and contracts. So it's important not to forget that. They are a government contractor, and the contract is certainly constructed in a very different way from how it would previously have been done. And that's why people talk about this being a commercial vehicle and a commercial endeavor. It's because NASA has not had the same degree of management over how the vehicle was developed. And that is possibly one of the reasons why it moved a whole lot faster than the strictly government program that is being developed by other contractors. So when you say, okay, it's important and SpaceX is more commercial than what came before, well, how can it get to be truly commercial, where the emphasis is more on flying either private individuals or other types of customers to space, and not just doing it for NASA? Well, the success of this mission in many ways will be seen as a validation that, yes, a company can take the initiative, can oversee its own designs and operations, can do all of these things without the same degree of oversight and management. And so that validation will then enable SpaceX to go and do whatever lobbying it needs to do on Capitol Hill, to perhaps get some of the other regulations loosened up or revised, to generally ease the process of bringing other types of paying customers into space. So it's an important step. There's still a lot of work to be done to really unlock the value of commercial space and commercial human spaceflight. At least at the orbital side. Now, when you ask about Virgin Galactic, it's very different because those are suborbital flights. And so they had their test flights, some of those happened last year. And you could say, well, those were Americans being launched to space from American soil. They didn't go into orbit. It was a very quick few minutes in space. And so it's certainly two very different markets, the way those operate. So Virgin Galactic is set up to be much more commercial from the beginning. Yes, they do have some research contracts from NASA, and NASA, of course, will take advantage of that. Anyone who can go into space, even for a short amount of time, that's potentially very useful for research purposes. But Virgin Galactic is certainly looking to the commercial market for most of its business at this point.
Thanks for explaining that difference to us. Talking about Virgin Galactic and commercial space flights, I read that more than 4,000 people have already either paid for or registered for Virgin's space flights, and that includes pop star Justin Bieber and actor Leo DiCaprio too. And this stock has been in news lately. Virgin Galactic was the first space company space tourism company to go public. It beat Jeff Bezos' Blue Origin and Elon Musk's SpaceX too. And the stock was one of the hottest stocks earlier this year. I was looking at the chart, and it's absolutely incredible. It went from about $7 a share in the beginning of December 2019 to almost $38 on February 19th. And now it is trading at about $17 a share. And recently, the Virgin Group had to give up majority control of this company because they had to fund other Virgin businesses which have been hit hard by the coronavirus. So tell us what is going on with this stock, and do you think this still has a lot of growth potential?
Virgin Galactic has, like many other newly public companies, experienced a tremendous amount of volatility, and certainly it's something that some investors handle differently than others. And I think what we saw as the stock price started coming back down to earth was that it was around the times that the COVID crisis had started escalating, at least here in the U.S., more than elsewhere. And I think a lot of investors started to take stock of what their holdings were and how different companies may perform in a current or post-COVID world. And a lot of attention that was very positive for Virgin Galactic left relatively quickly as fears, concerns, and other types of immediate opportunities started to present themselves. And so a lot of people started looking for certain types of healthcare related plays and work from home related types of companies. And I think what we saw was that, without as much excitement necessarily for the specific stock, a lot of investment dollars started going to other areas of the stock market. And, for specifically Virgin Galactic, one thing that they did also mention was that this might potentially slow down their expectations of their certain timelines that they have. So although they're still hoping to get Sir Richard Branson up into space relatively soon, I think a lot of businesses had to look at different avenues, and Virgin Galactic is actually one of those companies that had worked on trying to build equipment that could help for various medical purposes related to COVID assistance. So I think there was certainly an altruistic pivot potentially that could have also taken a little bit of focus away, that could also potentially have slowed down some of the timelines. That said, they're still very eager to continue forward with their mission and to start having some of those tickets get redeemed and send people into space. So many investors have potentially shorter, attention spans or horizons for some companies. This is one that has, intentions to bring people to space and to bring them to space soon. But just like any other type of company trying to do what they do, they also understand the risks and the importance of succeeding. And they're taking their time to make sure that they do it right and safely, because ultimately that is something that could potentially breed more customers if they're able to show a safe track record. So I think maybe investors got a little bit ahead of themselves earlier on. I think the COVID crisis probably brought some other things into perspective, moved some investment dollars around. A lot of people may have taken some of those quick profits that they may have made in the stock and redirected those investments elsewhere. But they're still moving forward. They still have their goals. Yes, there was a sale of stock, but you look at Amazon and their CEO Jeff Bezos as well sells about $1 billion worth of his stock every year to go fund one of his space ventures, Blue Orbit. So it's not something that is completely surprising to have seen it. This most recent block sale. But this is something that certainly I wouldn't be shocked if we saw more volatility ahead. But I think this is a healthy pullback that the stock has had, and it seems to have found a little bit more support at its current levels.
isn't it a wonderful sign of the maturing of the space industry that you now have people selling their space stock to fund their other ventures rather than doing what Jeff Bezos is doing, selling other ventures to fund his space business?
Wonderful. Great point. I also wanted to ask you about the US Space Force. It had its first space mission recently. Could you tell us about that?
Certainly. So the Space Force is something that has been also many years in the making. People have been talking about this idea in many different forms, but it really did come together at the end of last year with the National Defense Authorization Act, which was signed into law in late December, that created the Space Force. The other thing to know, though, is that earlier last year, there was also the creation of U.S. Space Command. And there's a distinction between the two that I think that people often lose track of. So the Space Force, its role is to organize, train, and equip the forces that ultimately support operations run by U.S. Space Command, or in support of other commands. And so Space Force is not the thing that's going to be going out and making a lot of decisions necessarily about how everything is going to look in the future, in space, as far as the military is concerned. That's more the role of Space Command, to do that planning and strategic assessment. So yes, Space Force did have its first mission in March of this year. That was the launch of the last AEHF communications satellite. That's Advanced Extremely High Frequency Satellite. So I believe it was the sixth as well in the series. So the US military, for many years, has relied on satellite communications to support operations all around the world. They do that through a combination of having their own extremely secure, extremely well-protected communication satellites, and then they also use commercial capacity that they can just buy on the open market from many of the companies, in fact, that are part of the UFO ETF. And so, this was the culmination of that satellite program, getting all of those into space. And it was really a handoff, because since these things do take years, that mission was originally planned by the Air Force, which had responsibility for space up until it was handed off to the Space Force. So it was a good start for them. Certainly bodes well for the future of the force. We've seen a number of other things, like the first Academy graduates being commissioned directly into the Space Force. That happened in the past few months. Service members across the Air Force are being offered the opportunity to transfer over to Space Force. And that may be opened up to Navy and Army as well at some point, because each of them has accumulated a certain amount of space expertise over the years, in the absence of it all being concentrated in a Space Force. So they're off to a good start, and it'll be interesting to see what they do next.
Sure, it would be very interesting. So let's talk about the space economy in general. So I read that Morgan Stanley estimates that the global space industry could generate revenue of $1.1 trillion or more in 2040, up from about $350 billion in 2018. And in fact, Bank of America estimates that the space economy could grow to about $3 trillion by that time. So what are your thoughts on the size of this space economy currently and its growth potential?
So the space economy, as it's currently tracked, it is a combination of government spending and commercial activity. And the commercial activity makes up roughly 80% of that current figure. I think you mentioned 350 or 365. It depends on how you count the space economy. I like the Space Foundation's number of $415 billion for 2018. That's mostly because I used to work for the Space Foundation, so I'm very familiar with how they calculate that. And so people have looked at those assessments of the current space economy. And yes, as you mentioned, Morgan Stanley, Bank of America, UBS also did an estimate, which is very close to that of Morgan Stanley, a little less than $1 trillion by 2040 was their figure. And so people are looking ahead and saying, just what are the different parts of the economy? How is it growing? How big is it really going to get? And to understand how it grows, it helps to understand that much of the technology development is still funded in that 20%, the government space programs. They're the ones that are really putting the most into R&D and just generally pushing to make space more accessible and more valuable in many ways. And then on the commercial side, you have the companies that are taking that technology. A fair number of them now are doing some very substantial R&D on their own, and so they're taking it. They're creating value from it. So one of the major segments within the space economy is location-based services. You think about all of our smartphones and other devices that have the GPS chips in them, or other chips that are very similar, talking to other satellite constellations that we don't need to get into right now, to just give you that information. Where are you at any given time? And you think about all of the different applications that have been built on that, whether it's ride sharing or food delivery, or even just optimizing travel. And yes, I realize we're not traveling quite as much these days, but when that comes back, you think about the tremendous amount of fuel savings and the efficiency that comes from always having the shortest route to wherever you're going. So there's that part. And then there's a huge broadcasting and communications segment as well. Those are two of the things that space does extremely well, because you can reach the entire planet in a matter of seconds. So there's all of this potential for growth. And as we look ahead at communications in particular, and 5G, and just this incessantly growing hunger for data that seems to be a part of modern life, that's, I think, what people have really latched onto and said, okay, how can space be a part of that? How can space be an important part of that? And so when you get these projections from the various financial institutions, a lot of it is on the basis of that. Broadband internet services that cover the globe. And this is one of the other things that SpaceX is doing, is building out its Starlink satellite program to provide that broadband internet. And I would also point out that I should have mentioned this earlier. SpaceX, the fact that they're having such great success with commercial human spaceflight and with their own commercial launch services, they've actually launched satellites for, I think, 6 or 7 of the companies in the UFO ETF. So those companies benefit directly from SpaceX having continued success and achieving great things with reusability of launch vehicles and generally bringing the prices down, because that all improves the access to space. So, it's something that has ramifications across the industry, and makes a lot of things substantially easier, or at least less expensive. So, with all of that happening, it means that there is now room for this tremendous amount of experimentation and exploration and frankly risk taking. People taking financial risks and saying, yes, I'm going to invest in a space company. Maybe it's a startup, and I don't know yet what the prospects are going to be, but I know that they have a much better chance of getting their hardware to space and testing it and using it to create value. And that, I think, is a large part of why people are excited about space today.
Definitely very exciting. So let's talk about your ETF now. It's the first pure play space ETF, the Procure Space ETF, with a very interesting ticker symbol UFO. Tell us a little bit about this ETF. how stocks are selected and weighted in this index? And could you also talk a little bit about the top holdings?
We launched this fund in April of last year, so the fund has now completed its first full year and a little bit more since inception. And it currently holds just under 30 publicly traded space companies from around the world, all specializing in various areas across the space economy. So you have companies that are doing things such as rocket manufacturing and launching, satellite operations and manufacturing, companies actually creating components that are reliant upon space-based systems, satellite imagery, and sensors. And so you have a very wide range of companies that are in this fund that has very little overlap with existing ETFs out there. So someone that's actually looking to get exposure to the space industry could look at UFO as a way to get some diversified exposure and some new exposure for their portfolios as well. And there are some diversified aerospace and defense names, but as you had mentioned, this is the first pure play space ETF. So what was very important to that was making sure that some of these larger diversified aerospace and defense names that didn't have a very large percentage of their weighting focused just on space, we didn't necessarily want the other core parts of their business necessarily being what propels the space ETF upwards or downwards. So you'll notice that there's actually a tranche set aside up to 20% of the fund that can be invested in these diversified aerospace and defense names that certainly are very large players in the industry, and we'd be remiss not to have them included as holdings. But really what we've seen was, over the course of this first year, we have seen an incredible amount of news flow bringing attention back to the space industry. And some of that coincided with the 50th anniversary of the lunar landing, announcements of Space Force. Very recently, the new presidential space order that was passed, as well as a lot of areas that people weren't necessarily expecting to necessarily happen so soon, which is kind of the many countries around the globe starting to lay out what they plan to do for the defense and militarization of space from their own country's perspective. And what we're seeing now is that this space race is really starting to heat up. And the countries that's been probably the most vocal has been the U.S. But as a countermeasure to that, we've also seen allies as well as adversaries from around the world also stepping up their rhetoric, as well as putting forward some of their plans as far as how they look to carve out their own destiny in outer space. So what we've kind of noticed is that there are many different industries that are getting very excited about what they're going to do in space, as well as seeing that there's a strong investment climate for those looking to raise capital for space-related businesses to actually now go out and be able to raise capital. So we're seeing kind of the groundworks being laid for what could be a very exciting industry going forward. And I think one of the great things about having been able to bring UFO out is that now people that are also entrepreneurs or scientists or people looking to enter the space industry now realize by looking at this fund that there is potentially an opportunity for, if they go public, potential inclusion into a fund such as this, or the ability to get government contracts with agencies such as NASA or other defense groups. And so I think we're really starting to see this shift in mindset that space previously was this sci-fi, far off, out of sight, out of mind industry to one that's already affecting our everyday lives and showing some really interesting potential for how it may shape many different industries going forward.
Excellent. So, Micah, can you tell us about how holdings are selected and weighted in the index that you created?
Yeah, absolutely. And Andrew touched on many of the most important points, including that we wanted to make sure that this was truly a space index. And so it's built on deep knowledge of the space industry and the companies that are involved in it, but also on very stringent criteria. So the space industry is one of those that has an extremely long tail. There are the companies that, a relatively small number, that are so focused on space, but then there are literally thousands of companies, not all of which are publicly traded, of course, that have a role in the supply chain for the industry. And so once you get past that initial block of companies, you start getting into the ones that, yes, they may have a NASA contract, but it's really not a core focus for their company. And so in order to focus our attention on those companies that place an emphasis on space, we looked for ones that either had that had space-related revenue that was either at least 20% of their total annual revenue or more than $500 million of annual revenue. And so that really weeded out a lot of the ones that are farther down the supply chain, that are diversified, but space barely shows up in any of their public communications unless they want a feel-good story to say, yes, we were a part of that telescope or that launch or whatever is good for PR on a given day. So we focus on that. And then Andrew mentioned, we have the two different tranches. There are the pure play space companies that have the majority of their revenue coming from space. And what that functionally means is most of them have pretty much all of their revenue coming from space in that pure play tranche. And then there's the diversified tranche, where you have the companies like Boeing and Lockheed Martin, which are certainly perhaps better known for other things that they produce besides space, but they still do billions of dollars in space business every year, and they are major players in the industry. So with that approach, we feel that we've captured the essence of the industry, and that it really does provide someone looking for that space exposure a way to do it in a diversified way.
Excellent. So I'm looking at the top holdings: Mexa Technologies, Dish Network, Orcom, Trimble, Garmin, and Virgin Galactic is also there among the top holdings. Would you like to talk about any of these companies that you really like?
So, for me, it's not necessarily about playing favorites. For me, I think what we find really interesting about UFO is being able to provide this diversified exposure to these many companies doing all different things across the space industry. And, I see space as a long-term theme. Space in its own right isn't a technology that is going to be replaced. Space is an economy. It's an industry that brings many different players with many different backgrounds, with varying goals and ideas for products and services. And the more space infrastructure that we build out, the more types of companies and service providers and assistance that's required to keep these going and to keep the economy growing. So, I was thrilled to partner with Micah and others to bring out this first pure play space ETF, because we think that this is an ever-changing and evolving and a highly collaborative industry where it's very difficult to try to pick favorites and winners. But to me, that's the reason to create an ETF, to give investors that instant diversification at a low cost. And so while Micah is constantly learning and researching about the industry itself, to me, it's very important to have that diversified vehicle for investors that are looking to get some broad exposure into the industry. But I'll certainly pass the mic to Micah to let him talk about some of the companies that he's looking most at.
Well, just thinking about some of the top holdings, I think it illustrates the diversity of the industry. So you have a company like Maxar Technologies that does everything from building satellites to operating Earth observation systems. So, they're the ones that provide a lot of the satellite imagery that you've probably seen, whether it's through Google Earth or in a news story. Then you have the communications and broadcasting companies. Dish Network, obviously, satellite TV, that's a huge consumer market. A company like Orbcom, they were doing machine-to-machine communications is what it was called. It was basically Internet of Things before that term was even created. There are companies like Trimble and Garmin that focus on the navigation aspect. So you have all of those location-based applications and sensors. You have smart farming equipment that can go out and steer itself around the field autonomously because you've defined, here are the borders of the field. So we were looking at the different companies that are out there, taking human spaceflight as an example, and we weren't sure whether the first one to go public would be Virgin Galactic or SpaceX or maybe even Blue Origin. You have different profiles for those founders and different goals. So you could make a guess that it might be Virgin, and it turned out that that was the case. But the point is that we wanted to make sure that no matter what happened in the space industry, that the index could be flexible and could accommodate it so that it would continue to evolve as the industry evolves. And we feel this is important both for the space economy in order to help investors capture that value, but also for the broader economy, because these companies have a very interesting potential role to play in that, whether it's communications, being the backbone of our modern information society, or a company like Virgin Galactic, which right now is focused on suborbital flights, but someday maybe providing rapid point-to-point transportation across the world. And they've announced some interesting partnerships, say, with Boeing, to look into those possibilities. So, wherever these companies go, we're certainly planning to still be there and track that activity and present it in a form that we believe will be of interest to people.
So I read recently that Tom Cruise will be shooting a movie in space, and he's partnering with NASA and SpaceX. Do you know anything about that movie or when it is expected to be released?
I don't know the dates there. I think it's really exciting because it actually brings people to this thing that we all talk about so often, and bring someone without necessarily a space background. And I really started enjoying Tom Cruise during Tropic Thunder when that came out, and love seeing the different action that he's done since and prior as well. But I think what it does is it makes space something that's more tangible to people. I think it's really exciting to see how different industries are actually approaching the International Space Station and opportunities to do things that I've never done before. And what an incredible venue to do it in. Outer space to actually film a space-related movie. I think it's truly fantastic, and maybe it'll be the first of many, but something that the International Space Station has showed that it wants to do, which is to open space for business. And the entertainment industry is one of those that I'm excited to see that they're taking an early leap into that.
Yeah, definitely very exciting. Can't wait for it. That's all we have time for today. Micah and Andrew, thanks again for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. If you want to learn more about this ETF, please visit procureetfs.com. Make sure to be on the lookout for the next edition of ETF Spotlight, and also make sure to subscribe. If you have any comments or questions, please email podcast@zacks.com.
This material is being provided for informational purposes only, and nothing herein constitutes investment, legal, accounting, or tax advice, or a recommendation to buy, sell, or hold a security. Do not act or rely upon the information and advice given in this podcast without seeking the services of competent and professional legal, tax, or accounting counsel. Publication and distribution of this podcast is not intended to create, and the information contained herein does not constitute an attorney-client relationship. No recommendation or advice is being given as to whether any investment or strategy is suitable for a particular investor. It should not be assumed that any investments in securities, companies, sectors, or markets identified and described were or will be profitable. All information is current as of the date herein and is subject to change without notice. Any views or opinions expressed may not reflect those of Zacks Investment Research as a whole.